Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I don't move until I know you're engaged. All right, as he said, my name is Christie Avalos, and I am president and CEO of a company called Accessology. We do nothing but accessibility. I personally have been doing access issues since 1977. I was on the White House lawn the day it was signed, so I've been involved for a while. And as you will see, I have great passion for what we do. And I also know that every time we do a transition plan, we can make it better. And so we are in the process of kind of finalizing this phase of the City of Edmond transition plan. And so I want to kind of help you understand, first of all, what is a transition plan and why after 29 years are we doing this, and what are going to be the benefits of it. And most importantly is where you will have a voice in the process to make sure that the City of Edmond is paying attention not just to what the law says, because they have always had to do that, but what is going to serve the community the best. Every community is a little bit different. Some have a school for the deaf in the middle of it, or they have different people, different demographics. And so making sure that we're not just doing one thing just because the law says it, but actually encompassing what the needs are of the community. I also want to tell you that, as I mentioned, I've been doing this a very long time. And very seldom do I find ADA coordinators that are as willing and as excited about this process as Phil has been. And so I congratulate both Phil and the City of Edmond, because you've got a really, really good opportunity here. So that we've kind of gone through the introductions. We did this, Accessology did this in conjunction with a company called Kimley-Horn. Kimley-Horn is an engineering firm. So they were out there looking at the sidewalks and things like that, and we'll talk about what they did as well as what we've done, as part of this overall process. One of the biggest parts of this is getting your input. And so questions that you have, feel free to stop me, and we will do our best to get the questions answered. If we don't have answers, we'll get answers to you. Some of them I can answer, some of them Phil can answer, and some of them we may have to do a collaborative effort. And so don't hesitate. This is for you. This is your meeting. So we want your input. So the goals and objectives, way at the beginning when we started this first process in 2015, was really, overall to improve accessibility. And like I said, one of the things that I have loved about working with Edmond is it wasn't just about meeting a law. There's three different things that we find when we work with different communities around the country. We've got those that just want to check the box off and say, yes, we did what we have to do. And then you've got those that are really engaged, that are willing to do whatever they need to do. And it's like peeling back layers of an onion. We just keep peeling things back, and then we go, okay, you know what? We didn't see that this was a need, or somebody brings that information forward, and then we can address it. And so it's got to be interactive. And then there are some that are sort of in the middle. There's the ones that really want to do it well, and there's the ones that just want to check off a box, and then there's most of them fit somewhere in the middle. However, like I said, Edmond was really very engaged. We also want to encourage participation from you as citizens, as employees. We want, there's no way, even though I've done this for over 40 years, there's no way I'm going to think of everything. There are going to be things that are important to you that may not even be addressed in the law. That doesn't mean you can't bring them up. I'm always one that will say, okay, the law doesn't say we have to do that, but that might make sense to go ahead and do in this particular community. So I'll give you an example, and this is one that I use all over the world now. We did some consulting when they built the new terminal at DFW Airport. DFW Terminal D was an international terminal, a $2 billion terminal, okay? And so I had an advisory board that was made up of people with disabilities that I always do when I do large projects like that. And one of them was the Southwest Regional Director for the American Foundation for the Blind. So she herself is totally blind. And she said, you know, I have to travel for work, and I can navigate an airline terminal if you give me some clues in which to do so. All right, well, what do you mean by that? She goes, well, for instance, if you just change the flooring at the gates, I could count the flooring changes, come in at gate 38 and count the flooring changes down to gate 22 where my connection is. Well, that's brilliant. I'd have never thought of that. That's not a world I live in. And so if you go to DFW Terminal D, you'll see that the gates are in pairs, and they had an $11 million art budget. And so we went to the art people and we said, figure this out. And so they have these big 25-foot circular medallions of mosaic tile. Came out of the art budget, didn't cost any more. To you and I, it just looks like an art piece. To somebody with low vision, it's a different color. And to somebody with no vision, it's a different texture. And so, although that wasn't in the law that said that they had to do that, a suggestion from a citizen said, you know, hey, this would be awesome. And it changed everything. As a matter of fact, DFW Airport got awards all the way from the blind population in Tokyo for doing that. And so I encourage you and anybody that you know, any groups that you might be associated with that have people with disabilities that, that they have a voice. You know, let them know that there is a voice that they can be heard. And we're going to go over both the survey and the interactive map that Phil mentioned. But Edmond wants to hear from the community. Another part of this requirement is to develop a list of the barriers. What has to be fixed? You can't fix it if you don't know it's broken. And so part of it is looking at every building, looking at every park, every sidewalk, every intersection, every curb ramp, every bit of technology, every program, and making a determination that either it complies or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it goes on to a list of things that need to be fixed. And then over, you know, however many years it takes, things will be getting fixed. And that's the whole purpose of developing the transition plan. When we do the assessments, we also provide some suggestions for possible removing of those barriers. I may have 2 or 3 suggestions. They might come up with another one. There isn't a, yes, you have to do this. It's just, yes, you have to comply. And there's sometimes different ways in which that can be done. That's also a place that we can get some input from the community. And then, of course, how's it going to be paid for? You know, cities, I don't know if you know this, but they don't have unlimited money. And so there's always a question of how are we going to do this? And so we help identify various funding sources that come from the federal government, but also how can we overlap funding? We're already getting this paid for something, and we can make all of the accessibility improvements in that area you know, during another project. And so sometimes we can overlap funds, which works out really well. Now, a transition plan has some specific elements that it's required to have. So for instance, we have to identify the physical barriers. Like I said, you can't fix it if you don't know it's broken. So we looked at buildings and parking lots. We looked at parks and all of the recreational areas and facilities. We looked at the sidewalks and the intersections and the curb ramps and all of the pedestrian elements in between them. And we put together a list of barriers, and we also made suggestions for the improvement, like we said. Then what will happen is they'll take that great big list, they'll figure out what is it going to cost to fix everything and how quickly can we get it done. And then the transition plan will become that long. So we're still in that process to really figure out how it's going to get fixed, when it's going to get fixed, and who's going to be responsible for fixing what. Those are required elements. If we don't have those elements, it's not really a plan, it's just an inventory. And so an inventory without action doesn't really do anything, okay? So when it comes to the infrastructure, and one thing that I want to make sure that, that people understand is that the ADA itself doesn't say you have to have anything, okay? ADA doesn't say you have to have sidewalks. You decide as a community, yeah, we want to have sidewalks, and ADA says if you have them, they have to be for everybody. Everybody has to, or everything that they do, they have to do for everybody. But ADA doesn't say you have to have restrooms. Plumbing code says you have to have restrooms. ADA says, and they have to be for everybody. So everything that a city does, they need to do for everybody. And so part of it isn't just the infrastructure. I've already talked about how we have gotten into looking at the infrastructure, but we've also had to look at all of the programs that are offered. For instance, sometimes you'll have a policy in place. Let's say in order to take out a library book, you had to have a driver's license. Well, a lot of people with disabilities don't drive, so that would be a discriminatory policy. So we then have to look at all of those policies for all of the programs that they offer and determine, is that policy in place for everybody, or is it only going to work for certain people? And if it's only going to work for certain people, what do we do to change the policy? What process do we have to go through? Does it have to go through city council? Is it something that can be done, locally and quickly? And so all of that gets wrapped up into what is a transition plan. Another important part of it is knowing what has been complained about. If somebody's complaining about something, then we want to be able to take that complaint and move it right to the top of the things that need to be resolved. And so these were existing complaints at the beginning of the process. Now, a lot of these have already been resolved, but an existing complaint can be anything from a policy to an employment issue, could be an employee, to a facility issue, not having accessible bathroom, not having compliant parking. Any of those things can be a complaint. And so there are two things to help the citizens inform the city of the areas that need attention. Actually, there's three things, because there's the survey that we'll talk about a little bit later. There's the interactive map, which I'll show you in a little bit, but there's also what is referred to as a grievance process. So you can go onto the City of Edmond's website, you can click into the grievance process, and you can fill out the form and say this is what happened, or this is where I have an issue, and that will get to Phil and his internal team will work on getting a resolution for it. And that's part of the required process that the ADA put in place. Now, when we started looking at the facilities, we've looked at pretty much all of the facilities and parks that have that are in Edmond. We looked at all of the signalized intersections. 77 signalized intersections were evaluated, and all of the non-signalized intersections along the routes that we looked at. When we start looking at pedestrian crossing issues, we're not just going, oh yes, they have a curb ramp, or no, they don't. We're looking at every aspect of the curb ramp. Is the slope right? Is the cross slope right? Is there a level change? Does it have flares? Does it have the detectable warnings to make sure that somebody who has low or no vision is aware that there's a street in front of them? All of the different elements that are required were evaluated as part of this process. Through the process, we looked at 73.5 miles of arterial roadways. That's not everything in the city, but it is the main areas where there's pedestrian activity. Okay, so you'll always start with the arterials because that's where we have most of the pedestrian volume. We're looking at the running and the cross slope to make sure that those comply. Any level changes where people can trip, any like areas where water might be pooling or ponding. So we're looking at all of the different elements. Again, we're not just going, yes, they have sidewalk here. No, they don't. We're looking at all of the elements and the condition of that sidewalk to make sure that they know where we have to have maintenance. And that allows us to prioritize what's going to get done first versus what's going to get done last. Okay, so it depends on a couple of things. When we prioritize, we're looking at, first of all, where is it? Okay, if it's out in a rural area where there's no pedestrian activity, that's going to be a lower priority than something that might be right up here by City Hall. Or where we know we have people in the community that are affected by that sidewalk that has, gone into disrepair over time. So when we hear, and that's what the map is for, when somebody lives in a community and they can go into the community and say, look, the sidewalk here is really bad, then we know that that needs to be elevated into the overall priority because it's specifically affecting somebody who lives in that area. Okay, we're also looking at things like the tactile warnings, making sure that the sidewalk is wide enough that it at least meets the requirements of being 4 feet wide, that there's passing spaces so that two people can pass each other without one of them getting run off the sidewalk. Do we have trees that are growing right over the sidewalk where somebody could hit their head? So all of those kinds of factors get taken into place. Now the way ADA works is if you build something brand new, well, then it has to comply. There's no excuse for it not to comply if it's built brand new. And brand new under the ADA is anything that has been built since January 26, 1992. Okay, so all of those elements that are being built brand new should fully comply. But a city like Edmond has a lot of stuff that was in place long before ADA. And so when it comes to alterations, there's some minimum things that have to be done. If you do an alteration, and the way that it's worded in the law is if there's an alteration to an area that contains a primary function. Okay, so if they're altering an area, not altering the primary function. Okay, that's what gets restaurants in trouble all the time. They say, well, it was a restaurant, it's still a restaurant. We didn't alter the primary function, so we didn't have to do anything. That's absolutely false. It's not altering the primary function, it's altering the area that contains the primary function. So you have to look at each building and say, well, what's its primary function? So if you've got a high rise of offices with multi-tenants, offices are the primary function. So if they do a tenant finish out in that office building, they're altering an area that contains a primary function. Okay, whereas the office of a restaurant's not the primary function, the dining room is. The dining room of a school's not the primary function, the classrooms are, but you could have a dining hall and then it would be the primary function. So we look first at what is it that is being altered and is it an area containing a primary function, and if it is, then it has triggered 5 elements that the law requires to be brought into compliance. It starts with getting people to and into the building, because it doesn't do any good to have an accessible restroom if they can't get in the front door. So we have to make sure that whether it's from public transportation or from parking, that they can get into an accessible entrance. Once they enter that front door, do they have access to the goods and services that are offered in that facility? Are the counters lowered? Do they have auxiliary aids for people who need them? Do they have elevator access for upper levels? All of those kinds of things. Then it's the restrooms. While you're there, can you go potty? Okay, and then it's things like drinking fountains, telephones, the other common use elements that people have. Now, if they don't have drinking fountains, well, then they don't have drinking fountains, then it comes off the list. But if they have them, then we have to have 2. One for people of short stature or people who use wheelchairs, one for people who have trouble bending or stooping at a standard height. So alterations are done over, the whole goal of ADA from the very beginning was to say, as you do alterations, we're making facilities work for everybody, okay? However, then you have the opportunity for somebody to say, well, I haven't done any work in there, therefore I don't have to do anything. Because that's how building codes work. Building codes will say, if you're not doing any construction, well, then you don't have to use the building code. Building codes are very different than a civil rights law, which ADA is. So ADA came back and said, however, if there has been no construction activity, building owners have a continuing obligation to remove barriers in 5 main areas, regardless of planned construction activity. Well, guess what? It's the same 5. And so at this point in time, and the Department of Justice set forth what they think is the highest priority, like I said before. So to the Department of Justice, getting people to and into the buildings, kind of our number one priority. After 29 years, there shouldn't be any non-compliant parking anywhere in America. Sorry. Sadly, that's not the case. However, that's the way that the law was written. So basically it said, hey, if you're going to do construction, that's a great time to take care of these elements. But if you're not going to do construction, you still have to bring the facilities into compliance. And it doesn't matter if it is a mom and pop downtown cafe that has 2 steps in front of it. After 29 years, those should not be there, because their number one priority has been from the beginning of time, from the beginning of the ADA, to get people to and into the building. So then what you hear is, oh, we're grandfathered. Well, guess what? Nobody's grandfathered under the ADA. There is no grandfather clause. Okay, so building owners in your community, whether they are Title III, which is all of the private industry, or Title II, are going to be things that are owned by the city or the county or the school district. Okay, both of them have a continuing obligation for barrier removal. And so part of this process is helping you understand your rights and responsibilities. And for Edmond, they want you to understand who to go to. Okay, if you have an issue with a city-owned building, now they don't have authority over the restaurants and things that are in the community, but they could certainly, give them guidance on what they need to do. And I don't mean to speak for you, Phil. If I see you go, uh-oh. But like I said, Phil's very engaged. So that's how alterations work, okay? And then with Title II, with the existing facilities, and when I say Title II, again, that's the government buildings. Title III are all your private industry, all of your shopping centers and restaurants and everything built with or run by a private entity, not a governmental entity. So with your city-owned facilities, they don't have to bring every building into compliance. They have to make sure every program that they offer is in compliance. So if they had this really old building that was going to cost a ridiculous amount of money, because in order to bring it into compliance, they have to do full asbestos abatement and all kinds of things with an older building, they could move that program to a more accessible location and use that building for something else. That's perfectly acceptable under the ADA. Okay, but part of knowing what to move and what to do is going through this whole evaluation process. Okay, whoops, sometimes I touch things I didn't know I touched. All right, now, once they have something compliant, they also have to maintain accessibility. All right, so when we see sidewalks in disrepair, it's not good enough to say, well, they complied when we put them in. They have to be maintained in an accessible condition. And that's very, very hard to do because it's expensive. But part of it is helping the city understand to train the maintenance people on what to look for. Tree roots are gonna grow, sidewalks are going to shift. It's gonna happen. Some areas have soil that moves a lot more than other areas. And then it depends on how was the soil treated underneath the concrete. So we're gonna see shifting and movement and that kind of thing, and that's to be expected. But when it starts getting where it's egregious, where we have areas where people can trip or get stuck or, worse, get injured, that is when it really comes on people's radar, usually. With a transition plan, it's all on the radar, and then it gets prioritized. The egregious stuff will be at the top. The other stuff that's minimal will be towards the bottom, but then they'll be trained to say, okay, that one's not scheduled to be fixed until 10 years from now, but boy, it sure looks like it's getting worse. Maybe we need to move this one up. So it's a living document, okay? So when we start with the federal requirements for the City of Edmond fall under Title II, and Title II is written by legislators, but it is enforced by the Department of Justice. So not only do they want to meet the requirements for the citizens, but they have responsibilities to meet the requirements for both the state of Oklahoma and for the federal government. Okay. There's also another law out there that was in place long before ADA was. It came out in 1973, and it was called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there was a section in there which is referred to Section 504. A lot of people will just say, well, you know, you have 504 requirements, and that's what they're referring to. It's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it required all entities that receive public funding to ensure that they provide access to all programs, services, and activities. Well, guess what? Everything they do is either a program, a service, or an activity. And so that's been in place even longer than the ADA, and the ADA gives the finite detail as to what being in compliance means. Back in '73, they didn't even really, they wrote a law, but they didn't even know how to enforce it, really. And so 504 is still out there. It's still something that they have to pay attention to, but ADA kind of gave it some teeth. Now, back to the self-evaluation. They call it a self-evaluation because the government's not going to come in and do the evaluation. So some cities will do it by themselves. Some cities will hire consultants like us to go out and do the evaluations. And a lot of times, architects and engineering firms will jump on board and say, yes, we'll do this for you. But architects are usually really good at the buildings. Engineers are usually really good at the sidewalks. But it's the program, services, and activities that often doesn't get the attention that it needs. And that's a huge part of it. And so we have to look at things like city written and audiovisual materials. Do we have captioning? Do we have transcripts if there isn't captioning, if there's a video? Or if a city council meeting is being televised, do we have captioning for that kind of thing? So we're looking at not just the building. We have to look at where are the meetings met? Or where are they held? Where do people meet? So if you've got boards and commissions, well, and I want to be on the planning and zoning board, and I happen to use a wheelchair, where are those planning and zoning board meetings being held? And that's going to be true for every single program. We had a city a couple of years ago that they had a program where once a month, it was called Breakfast with the Mayor. So once a month they had breakfast with the mayor, and they would pick a different restaurant in their community, and they would have a breakfast meeting that anybody in the community could come to. Well, there was this little girl who did some special things for their community, and she happened to be in a wheelchair, and they wanted to give her an award, so they invited her to the breakfast with the mayor because they figured that it would be easy to get the media there and do this really good, presentation to her. And nobody really thought about the fact that the restaurant had 2 steps out front. So she shows up to get her award. Guess what the story ended up being about? It wasn't about the fact that she was getting an award. It was the fact that she couldn't get in to get her award. There were 2 steps out front, and nobody really stopped to think about it. And so when I look through the different things that a city offers, and I see that they have something like that, I'm going to go, okay, do you have a checklist of criteria of that facility must meet before you schedule a meeting there? All right, because mayor's not going to know what to look for. Somebody needs to go ahead in scheduling the program and saying, look, you're not eligible unless you're compliant with the ADA. We can't hold it in your restaurant. Okay. Let's see, I've already talked about most of this. Now, representatives of local and state disability organizations have a huge role here. Every city, town, village in America is required to comply with this. Okay, it doesn't matter if they only have 600 people. It doesn't matter if they only have 12 people. The whole town, one family. They have to comply. Now there are some lesser restrictions for really, really small towns. If they have less than 50 employees, for instance, they do things a little bit different, but it doesn't mean they don't have to do anything. And so again, ADA is 29 years old. And so anywhere in America, we have towns, cities, counties that are trying to get their transition plan in place, and they need voices from the disabled population. And so if you live in Edmond, but you work in another community, that might be a place that you can also lend your voice. Because they should all have some level of communication with the people who are affected in their community, whether they live there or work there, or just, you know, come on weekends for shopping or whatever. If you are affected by non-compliance, then you should have a voice and get involved in the local communities. Now, one of the questions people ask is, why now? It's been 29 years. Why are we doing this now? Well, there's a couple reasons. The transition plan was required to be done by the end of 1992. Okay? Some entities did it, but remember, ADA came out in 1990. When it first came out, nobody knew what they were doing. Okay? And so a transition plan at the end of 92 was probably 6 or 7 pages saying, yep, we have stuff to fix. But they didn't really understand what the plan, how to get the plan in place. And so the Department of Justice said that every 4 years the plan should be updated unless it's made a living document. Well, now we have such great technology. Now we can put things in the computer, and rather than having 11 binders behind somebody's desk that they have to keep going through, everything is available online. And so doing it at this point is getting it, first of all, modernized. It's also because the Department of Justice recognized that a lot of cities weren't getting it done. In 2010, at the 20th anniversary of the signing of ADA, they said, all right, we've given you 20 years. Now we're going to start tying it to funding. So if a city applies for a grant from Parks and Recreation or National Parks, they're going to have a box they have to check that says, yes, we have a transition plan. If they don't, they're not eligible. If they're looking for highway funding, if they're looking for Department of Education funding, from any of the federal agencies. And so they started tying it to funding in a way to really start pushing compliance because it wasn't moving fast enough. You know, for people who, especially architecturally, the biggest challenge is for people who have mobility impairments, people who use mobility aids. Attitudinally, it's everybody. Okay, and so we'll be overcoming the attitudinal barriers for years, but the architectural barriers should have a finite date. They drew a line in the sand and said anything built after this date should work for everybody, and everything before this date needs to be brought into compliance in at least those 5 main areas. And so the goal is to have a much more accessible America, and this is now translating to other countries. I've actually had the honor and privilege to write the disability legislation for the country of Peru, which was a really cool project. Okay, so it's ongoing. I don't think we'll ever be done, but we'll be better. We're so much better now than we were 29 years ago. So when they put in the transition plan requirements, they put, and I already went over this, the list of physical barriers, how they're going to fix it, how long it's going to take, you know, when it's going to get fixed, who's responsible, how it's going to be funded, and did they get input from their local community. Breaking that down into even smaller pieces, we have to look at every program or inaccessible facility. For instance, sidewalks are a program. They're part of a city's overall pedestrian program. So you might have areas where there are no sidewalks. That's okay, because the community decided they don't want sidewalks. Then you might have areas where the HOA has taken over. Okay, city builds them, HOA takes them over, the developer builds them, the HOA takes them over. It doesn't matter who owns it, it still has to comply. Okay, so if the HOAs aren't doing it, then the city should have the authority, and if it's within their jurisdiction, they should have the authority to at least contact the HOA and tell them, hey, we've gotten a complaint, we have no authority, it's your sidewalk, but it needs to be brought into compliance. Okay, so that's the way ADA is set up. Every piece of it, if you find some kind of an issue, you have a voice. ADA is your voice, okay? Now, it didn't get the way that it is overnight. It's not going to get fixed overnight. So patience is required. However, the further we get from the signing of ADA, the less patient people tend to be, and the less excuse entities have for not coming into compliance. And so what we did at the beginning of this process is look at everything that the City of Edmond has done, because they've been doing stuff. They didn't wait until we started this process. They've been doing stuff for years. But what were they doing, and was it good enough, and is it a good plan, or is it something that we might need to tweak? And all of that stuff came into the evaluation as they move forward, so they can take these entities and these issues and maybe be a little bit more effective and get better input from the local community. Okay. So our scope of work was to develop the comprehensive transition plan, which meant looking at, I mentioned boards and commissions, accessible communications, what communication do they have? When you go to the website, if you and I are seeing pictures, is there something that tells somebody who is blind what you and I are seeing? Okay, if the mouse gets hovered over it, it's supposed to give a description. And the description shouldn't say picture. The description needs to say what it is they're communicating in that picture, what you and I are seeing. When there is public transportation, that's part of ADA. So if you're dealing with transportation issues, go to the Transit Authority, okay? Looking at all of the on-street parking. On-street parking wasn't covered under the original version of ADA, but it was covered in a supplemental document called PROAG, which is the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. And so that covers on-street parking as well as city-owned parking lots. And you know, if we have accessible parking in a parking lot, which all parking lots should have accessible parking, and you determine that it's accessible, not because it has a sign, but because it meets the requirements. The slope is right, the size of the parking space is right, and most importantly, it connects to the sidewalk system so that once you park in a public parking lot, you can get to the facilities that are served by that particular lot. We also looked at things like the traffic signals, where you have the push buttons. Can we get to them? Can somebody using a mobility aid get to them? If somebody's blind, can they find them? They have to be in specific areas so that a person can find them. And as they change out and, you know, old equipment for new equipment, you'll see more and more of the accessible PED signals because, again, better technology. It's a newer time. Other elements to make the plan successful was a lot of discussion internally with the different departments. You know, Phil's a great ADA coordinator, but he's in one area. He's in the public works area, and that doesn't mean he knows everything that happens in the parks. And so we got representatives from all of the major departments to form a team so that if something happens in a park, the park liaison can talk to Phil, and together they can figure out how to resolve the issue. So we've got a great opportunity for good communication both up to Phil and down from Phil to the different departments. Okay. We also provided some training for the staff. Sometimes it's just as simple as knowing what you can say and what you can't say. You know, the customer contact people sometimes can say the wrong thing to the wrong person on the wrong day, and everybody's going to end up with a bad day. And so understanding what can you say, what can't you say, understanding how you can best serve people with disabilities, and how you can communicate with somebody who may be nonverbal. All of those things were part of the training, as well as just information on the ADA itself. And then going into how are we going to monitor this? Now that we have all this data, how are we going to monitor it and implement it? That's a big piece of it. Otherwise, it's a wasted effort, and nobody wants to waste that kind of money. When I mention program services and activities, this includes everything that they offer. If they have a program for people who just get out of jail, then we need to make sure that that's fully accessible. If they have a program for battered women, we have to make sure it's fully accessible. If they have an after-school program for kids, if they have a fire department program for citizens or a police program, all of that has to be looked at. But even more importantly, we have to look at every department that they offer, okay, and every program that's within that department, hiring and firing practices, job descriptions. Job descriptions have to be written in a way that a person with a disability can disqualify themselves, okay? They don't want us looking at somebody going, yeah, I don't think you can do this job. They want it to be specific. Like if it says must be able to lift 50 pounds above 27 inches on a regular basis, somebody who just had back surgery is going to look at that and go, yeah, I can't do that. Well, then they're not qualified for the job. But we also need to get rid of things like discriminatory language. There was a time when how fast you could type meant everything. Well, I can do 75 words a minute. Okay, well, now we have voice input. Maybe you can't type at all, but you can still input 75 words a minute, which means you still qualify for the job. And so going through all of the different job descriptions, emergency planning, okay, how would the city evacuate if we had to? Is there transportation? Is there any accessible transportation? If people are evacuating and coming to you, where are we sheltering them? Do we have a place for service animals to relieve themselves? Do we have refrigeration for medication? All the different things that aren't thought about on a normal day-to-day basis. Okay, and then the individual building issues. You know, there's a shooter in the building shut down. We have somebody with a disability on an upper level using therapeutic oxygen, and they have 20 minutes left in their Lindy Walker. What do we do? You can't anticipate every single emergency that's out there, but you can certainly plan better. Okay, and that's a really important issue to the Department of Justice at this point. So all of these different things become what makes a community a community. And in order for a person to feel like they're part of the community, their needs have to be addressed regardless of whether they're disabled or not. Okay. When we did a survey that we sent out to every department representative on that liaison team that we mentioned. And we asked them questions about their department. Where do you hold your meetings? Who runs this program? What is this program intended to do? What are the qualifications to get into this program? You know, all of the questions that helped us determine is that program compliant or not. Okay. Then when we went out into the field, we used technology. There's great technology out there now. Everything was done on a Panasonic tablet. It's all cloud-based. So we didn't, I mean, for many years when we would do transition plans, we'd be out there with our clipboards, paper, pencils, and a camera. Then we had to hope that this picture got into the right spot for that curb ramp, because once you get back to the office with 123 pictures of curb ramps, they all look the same. Now it's easier. Now we have better technology that puts it right where it needs to be. Then it goes into what is known as a GIS system, which is the informational system that is used by the people in the Public Works Department to figure out what they need to be doing in the city. And so it maps everything. And this is not only what is a sidewalk, but sidewalk crosses a drive apron, and then it crosses an alley, so it's the entire pedestrian route, and that tells them what is sidewalk and what is something else. That's just a look at the application that was used. But that allows them to, if they have a question about an intersection, they can be sitting at their desk and pull up everything that was seen on the day the evaluation was taken. Instead of having to run back out and go, oh yeah, I see what they're talking about. They can just click on the buttons and it'll pull up all of the pictures. They're all hyperlinked. So again, with all of this data, and it's a lot of data, and once you start printing it out into a transition plan, you're no longer getting that 6 and 7 pages that they thought was a transition plan in 1992. Now, it's like this thick, because it's everything. It's every intersection. There's a lot of information there. Most of them don't print it anymore. They just keep it electronically. And that's when they start going, okay, now that we have all of the data, we've got our baseline, how are we going to implement this? And that's when it starts going through the budget process. We're going to spend X number of dollars per year in complying with ADA. And so just to use round numbers, because this is the example I use no matter what size city I'm in. But let's say they determine, okay, we're going to do $1 million a year. They get to the end of the first year and they've only done $750,000. Well, then they try to do 1.25 in year 2. They get to the end of year 2 and they've only done $750,000. Well, then that's their number. Okay, it's their plan. They can budget in a way that is going to be reasonable, so that they're not having to take away your trash services and everything else, but that they can get things done in a reasonable period of time. And so a transition plan can be 5 years, it can be 10 years, it can be 20 years. Things like sidewalks may take 20 years, whereas program services and activities, that can probably be done in 3 to 5 years, just depending on what needs to be fixed. So all of that goes into the coffers. Then we have to figure out, okay, for the first year, we only have X number of dollars, what do we fix? That's when we start looking at prioritization. Now, a lot of companies that do what we do will put it into high, medium, and low. But when you take a city the size of Edmond, they're going to have hundreds of high priority items. So how do they know which is the highest? So what we do is we prioritize not only based on where it is, close to a government center, where we have a lot of pedestrian activity, where we have, like a big convention center and things that draw the public. But it's also looking at the ranking factors. How egregious is it? How bad was it? So we look at those two things, and then we take each of those categories, high, medium, and low, and we divide it into 4 subcategories. 1 through 4 is high, 5 through 8 is medium, 9 through 12 is low. So if we see something that's really bad, where there's imminent danger, somebody could get injured, that's going to be a level 1. Okay? Then they know that for the first year, they need to do all their level 1s. If somebody makes a complaint, it might be a level 7, but it's going to go to level 1 because we know that it's affecting somebody directly. And so your voice matters. Okay? Then as they get ready to do street work, for instance, they can pull up what they have, and red, bad, green, good. Everything else somewhere in between. And so they can look at it and go, while we're out there fixing that segment of road, we need to do these 7 curb ramps and that segment of sidewalk as part of that project. So it will help them in their planning process, their overall planning process. As they put together, or as we put together costs for them, it wasn't just the improvement costs, but what is it going to cost for architectural or engineering services? And if it's not going to be done until 5 years from now, well, then we probably want to have some contingencies in there. So everything that they got, this is a segment of sidewalk, has its own report. Okay, so a report for a segment of sidewalk, this says the unit costs up here, that says where it is, this says what's wrong with it, and then there's photos so that they can use those as part of their guideline. when we're doing a facility, it's similar. We have everything prioritized. We have the level of priority. We have the pictures and what's wrong. Okay, and so they have paper like that, if we printed it out, for absolutely everything. And then it's a matter of using the transition plan annually, saying this year, we got all of this done. Here's our plan for next year. The end of next year, this year, we got everything done. Here's our plan for next year. And every year, it becomes ingrained into their process instead of an afterthought, which ADA really started out to be. Okay? When we did, and you saw some of them, when we do the evaluations, we took pictures of everything. If I did a building, I may have 600 or 700 pictures for that building, because I'd rather have too many than not enough. And that way, the city has access to what was there on the day that the evaluation was taken. Okay? We won't have 600 to 700 in every report, but we do have a photo log that will have all of them that they can connect to should they need to. So we have, whoops, that's wrong. We have 100% complete. I don't know how the total ended up. I'll fix that. We have 100% complete. These are the different buildings and parks. So every park and building that we have assessed has now been complete. The reports have been done. We're just in that final kind of tie-up, pulling it all together and getting ready for the implementation process for the second phase. Now, they've already implemented a lot from the first phase. They didn't just sit around waiting for the second phase. So that's kind of where we are. As part of this, to get input, we put out a public survey. Okay, I'm actually going to sit for this because it's too small for me to read from standing up. So just to give you an example, and we haven't gotten a lot of input yet. We hope to get a lot more. We've had, but we've had some input, and this shows you every question, and I'll show you the live survey in a few minutes. So one question was, how would you rate the overall accessibility of the City of Edmond's programs and facilities? We had one person say that it was poor. Most said it was fair. Some said it was good, and some said it was very good. So it really just depends on what they were looking for. It doesn't mean the person who said it's poor is, have an attitude. It means that they have a different experience. Okay. Question 2, do you believe the city is accepting / accommodating of people with disabilities? There was a kind of overwhelming yes. They think that the city's very accommodating. A couple people said no. I think we had a total of 13, I think it was 13 responses, so that just kind of gives you the number. And this will change as we get more. We just launched this a couple of weeks ago. Have you experienced physical barriers or constraints on a pedestrian path or in a facility that you currently use or would like to use? So we had almost 70% said yes, 23.08% said no, and we had one person that said a family member or a loved one does. Which city buildings do you visit most often? Overwhelmingly was the downtown community area. Then there was utility customer service, the MAC, planning and public works, and then municipal court, which didn't have any responses on it. Question number 5, have you encountered inaccessible sections or poor conditions related to sidewalks? Yes. 61%, 30% said no, and again, one person was speaking for a family member. Have you encountered locations where curb ramps are missing or inaccessible? Again, some said yes, some said no, and nobody spoke for a family member on that one. Question 7, do you have difficulties accessing public schools within the City of Edmond due to inaccessibility of sidewalks or curb ramps in front of the schools? The majority said no on that one. There was one person that said yes, and then Most of them said, no, it's not applicable. Blue was no, not applicable, and yellow is no difficulties accessing public schools. And then there was family member. Have you encountered street or intersection crossings near a city building or park where lack of pedestrian crossing signals or medians affect your ability to cross the street? 2 yeses and the rest were no's. Question 9, are there any city programs, services, or activities that you would like to participate in or utilize but cannot due to accessibility challenges? So we had a couple people that said yes. This actually allows us to be able to go back to that person unless they put themselves in as anonymous and find out more detail if they didn't give it to us. We do have a comments section for them to provide more detail, so that we can specifically address the community needs. Again, 61% said no, and 1% said a family member would. Have you encountered any communication barriers within a city building or park which prevented you from utilizing or participating in a program, service, or activity? We had 1 person say yes, and the rest said no. Have you encountered any physical barriers or obstructions within a city building which prevented you from utilizing or participating in a program, service, or activity? A couple people said yes, and the majority said no. Have you encountered any physical barriers or obstructions within a city park which prevented you from utilizing or participating in a program, service, or activity? That was 100% no, which is a really unusual response. Huh? Well, it is for those people. It's true for them, but we've only gotten 13 out of the entire city, so I suspect we will get more information. And then question 13, do you have any general comments or items regarding accessibility you would like us to be aware of? And so we had people who said things like, I need to make myself more aware, but I have no idea where CityLink bus stops are, especially in my area. Are there covered designated bus stops? So these are just some of the comments that we got. Let's see, I'm physically active and healthy, so other than me just wanting better infrastructure for sake of seeing my hometown be a better city in this regard, it affects a lot of people. Also note to keep in mind, I love the e-scooters, but I hope the city makes sure they don't obstruct our sidewalks. 1 person said there needs to be a sidewalk installed by the Lowe's on Bryant. I've seen many people forced to walk in the driveway there since the intersection does not connect with sidewalks. That's the kind of information that the city needs so that they can make some good internal decisions. Okay, and then we did ask a last question, which was an optional question for them to just tell us if they have a disability themselves. Almost 70% did not have a disability who answered this, and then the rest, the 30%, said that they do. And then they gave details if they chose to about what their disability was or is. Okay, so that's where we are at this point. Now we're hoping after these meetings today that a lot more people are going to participate, that you'll take the information back into the people that you do life with, and that we get as many people as possible to participate in this. So what it looks like, this is the survey. It's done by SurveyMonkey. Okay, if you just put in surveymonkey.com/R, not sure what the R is for, and then Edmond ADA Accessibility Survey with hyphens in between each word. That's what this survey looks like. You can go online. It takes less than 5 minutes unless you decide to write a lot, and that's on you. And you can just check your answers for each of the questions that we just talked about, and you can see that there's opportunity for people to explain or to go into as much detail as they want to. The more detail we have, the easier it is for us to pinpoint the problem. Okay.
Christie, I just want to, I don't know if this is live or not, but I just want to remind everyone that those URLs are on that sheet that I handed out for those
Yeah. Yeah, did everybody hear that? Phil just wanted to make sure that you're aware that the sheet that you have has the link to this on it. Okay, so that's the survey. Feel free, and on this one, if there's a building that you go to that is not on that list, because we just kind of picked the ones that we think were the most popular, but if there's a building, by all means, put it in the information so that we have it. Okay, so that's the survey. Now, the interactive map is set up, and you're able to go in and you can zoom in as close as you want by just clicking on it. So let's say,
Your
yes.
street's not doing anything.
Huh. Thanks. Let me see, I have to do this. Now we have it. All right, so you zoom in, it's still zooming. So let's say you live somewhere near John Ross Elementary School. And somebody does. You see that blue line right there? That means somebody has gone in and made a comment, or, okay, so they didn't write anything, it's just sidewalk missing. So somebody hopes sidewalks will be there someday. All you have to do is go to an area that is important to you, and you can click routes. Yeah, you have to put in your email address. Doesn't cost you anything, you just have to put in your, I'm already in there, but. Okay. Go back. Now, let's say that we have an issue right here. Okay, so you go in and you can do routes, and you can click sidewalks in poor condition or sidewalk missing. So if you click sidewalk is in poor condition, then you can say from here to here. All right, gotta click it. It's really quite easy. There. So that is giving you the points. You can put as many as you want, or you can say, all right, you see the different icons. These are City of Edmond buildings, City of Edmond parks, traffic signals. You can go in and say there's a curb ramp missing right here. I need a curb ramp right there. Okay, and then you can put as much information about that curb ramp, northeast corner of whatever, and then you hit submit, and it goes right to the city so that they can then put up whatever information or look at whatever information you gave them. Dangerous or difficult crossing, difficult access. You know, I can get in, but it's not all that easy. And that's it. This one is difficult access at a city building. This one is difficult access at a park. No accessible parking. We need a pedestrian signal here, or the sidewalk was obstructed. Okay. You can also just go, I'm here, and it's going to, well, I don't have the locator, or I don't have the GPS set on right now. But on your phone, you can just say, I'm here, and it'll take you right to the point where you are, and then you can start filling in the information on wherever you are. And so if you put this on your phone, then you'll always have it to be able to give information as you navigate around the community. So once you're done drawing, you just click done, or you can tell it to undo the last point if you messed it up. I'm just canceling because I don't want to send Phil a whole bunch of erroneous information. But this is out there, it's live, it's available. I think we're going to keep it up for a year, I believe, so that they can get some information. So share it with your friends and family. It's kind of fun once you get into it, especially if you're doing it on your phone, because you can just put I'm here, just click that little I'm here, and it'll geolocate, and you'll see exactly where you are, and then you can say this sidewalk needs repair and there isn't one on the side. However you want to do it, okay? Give them as much information as you can. Any questions on anything that I have mentioned over the last hour? Yes, ma'am.
So, this whole thing, does that also include shopping centers?
Sure, you can put the information there. Now, the city has no authority over the shopping centers, but if they know there's an issue, they can certainly, and Phil, why don't you tell me what, because usually they can at least send information, hey, we've gotten a complaint about the shopping center and the non-compliance or whatever.
Yeah, we've done that before, and we've sent out letters through code enforcement for them to address it. Now, of course, the person who's complaining also knows that they can report through the DOJ, who has the enforcement for Title III entities like the grocery store. So, and that's really straightforward too. But I'll let them know that as well.
Maybe we
Answer your
had a
question.
discussion on, if you remember, about a certain shopping center really busy.
Yeah,
No problem. It's very much.
yeah. I think I know exactly what you're talking about.
I have a couple questions. Hello, Christie.
Hi.
Hey.
Good to see you.
You as well. You as well. I had about 2 or 3 questions. I think you may have answered one of them, but one in particular, I was just curious how you, other than word of mouth, how you are getting this survey out to the residents of Edmond.
Phil can answer that one.
Yeah, we've done a press release. I believe it was also taken through the UCO press office. I don't know what they call it over there, but I've requested that it be sent out again. So we'll probably do that again after these meetings. And we do have marketing also has social media and those kinds of outlets for the people that have signed up for that kind of thing.
Is it on your website too?
I'm not sure about that. It will be.
I'm
if
not
it's
sure either. I didn't check,
Yeah.
but that's a good place for it to be.
And I think you answered this in your presentation, but I wrote it down before you got to it. How many questions are in the survey? And I believe there were 14.
Yeah,
And
there's 13 questions. The 14th one is just asking
If you
about the
have it.
disability, yeah.
How did you determine that that was a good number, or I know you had to cut it off at some point, but
Yeah, we've done this for so long. We have found that if you get too many, people just sort of give up halfway through.
Okay.
And if you have too few, you don't get enough information.
Okay.
So most of those are tailored specifically to the community or the things that we found.
Okay. And I also really like the interaction with being able to go into the map and the line. So one of my bigger things that's kind of on my radar, as a person living with a disability. So say like parks and recreations, trails and whatnot, I may have talked to you about this earlier. In some of the new improvements, or as they're building parks or going back and revamping them, say that for whatever reason, a park bench needs to be replaced. So one thing that I see, and I think I told you about this discussion I had with an architect who had a different opinion. So normally they'll have like a landing area, I'll call it, or an area or a space that a wheelchair can sit beside a bench. But I don't normally go out and hang out with just like one person who is like able-bodied or disabled. So we almost create a problem because we all can't get off the sidewalk to make a clear path. And I was wondering, has any consideration, or I guess if I was concerned about that, I would go in the comment area and ask about the size, or if any thought has been put into the planning and improvement process of adding more area. So say like 2 landing areas or a piano hinge for the bench.
Yeah, okay, so that's not a requirement, but that's the kind of thing that makes a community a community.
Right.
So for instance, if you've got a basketball court and you want to have an area just outside of the basketball court, because a lot of times you've got the basketball court and then you've got benches, and you want to have an area where a bunch of people in chairs can gather, then sure, go ahead and tell the city. They're not required to do that, but that doesn't mean that in an area where you've got Paralympic training going on and you've got a lot of people in chairs, that wouldn't be considered. okay? The more information they have, then the more things that they can consider. There's always people in the community that donate money for specific things too. So that's the kind of thing the community can get around and say, you know, this would be a really good idea because there's a lot of us that play here, and get some, you know, local citizens that would participate in putting something like that in as well. So I would absolutely make it known on the map.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what you were saying earlier too about the transition plan being a really long plan, 20-year plan. High, medium, we have high, medium, and low priorities in that. But if someone brings to my attention, emails me, or goes through the grievance process and says, hey, you know, I'm dealing with this right now and I need a fix, that goes straight to the advisory board, and we try to start addressing those things immediately.
And the real reason I kind of bring that up as well, I'm a little biased, but in my personal opinion, in the planning phase, 5, 10 years, 15, 20, I don't think in the building and development we're putting enough thought into how many more people are going to be disabled. So from a population standpoint, there's going to be a need for more volume.
Right. Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, and I don't know if you said it or with Bill Botten or somebody, if we all live long enough, we're going to be disabled.
Yeah. Yeah, the disability community refers to us as TABs, temporarily able-bodied, because if you live a normal life expectancy.
We say able-bodied.
Yeah.
I don't know that I need that, but I have two things that I'll mention, and one is in running around with Willis a great deal over the past couple of years, I've been surprised, and I think Willis has, at the number of it's always young men when we go to the YMCA, or we go to the gym to work out, or we go to Walmart early or late, and they're using mom's or grandma's car with the disability tag, and they park in the disabled parking, and they're bouncing out at 5:30 in the morning, going to play basketball for 2 hours, and believe me, they're not disabled. And I've just been that's not once. I mean, that's happened 30 times at different locations, and I've really been frustrated and surprised at the amount that goes on. The other thing is on residential sidewalks, it always kind of seems to be like you can't get there from here, meaning it's usually the developer put it in 40 years ago or whenever, an older section, and it's the residents' problem, and it kind of seems to stop there. Any comments or advice on that?
Yes. So let's start with the first thing that you said. Yes, people are rude. Okay. I have this little thing that I actually made up that looks like a ticket from a police officer, and it says, would you rather trade places or spaces? This isn't a ticket, but it could have been. You've been caught parked in a handicap parking space. And I put those on cars all over the place. I'm sure I'm not very popular, but I put those all over the place because I think people need to know. Now, some people do have a hidden disability, a heart condition or something like that. But more often than not, it's laziness. And when I have an opportunity to speak, I usually mention, leave the spaces for the people who need them. So that does happen, and communication. I think the embarrassment of getting caught, which is why I developed those little tickets. I think knowing that they got caught is hopefully enough to deter at least some of them from doing it again. So
Until they get a fine.
right. Well, and a lot of cities now have a citizens patrol program that is authorized to give tickets if they find people parked in accessible parking spaces that do not have proper designation on their car. They did change in Texas. They changed the law so that you have to have a picture of the person that's disabled on the hanging tag, so that if they borrow grandma's car, it doesn't work. Okay, another thing, and so each state can kind of fight for that. Another thing that is important is if you go to city council meetings and you talk about this kind of thing, usually the funds that they get, the $250 fine that people can get for parking in accessible parking spaces, is undesignated. So I like to tell police departments that can pay for your policeman's ball every year if you just issue the tickets for it, because a lot of times they're reluctant to issue tickets. But it's about education. They need to understand. Okay. As for your second question, I just lost what the second question was.
Residential sidewalks.
Yeah, residential sidewalks. Okay, that's what this map is for. Okay, when you're in a residential area and it doesn't connect, the only way Phil's going to know that that's an issue is if people go in and say, hey, right here, this is a problem. And that's the reason that we developed this map for that very purpose.
Phil, can the policeman go on the shopping center parking lot into a handicap area if it's not, they're not using it appropriately and give a ticket? It's a private shopping center parking lot, but it's designated handicap and somebody's parking there that shouldn't be. Can
They can be ticketed, yes. Is that what you're asking? The person who's parking there, is that what you're asking? They can be ticketed, yes.
they can be?
I think what he's referring to, though, Phil, is sometimes police officers will say that's on private property, so
Right.
we have no authority.
Right.
But they actually do have authority. That's all done locally, and so it's really just a matter of. Well, no, it's a matter, if they think they don't have authority, it's going to be a matter of just handling that locally to make sure that they know they do have the authority.
Hello, my name is Anna. Thank you so much for doing that. That was some great information. I took
My
a lot
pleasure.
of notes, so thank you. My question is about hearing loss. We do a lot for people who have physical disabilities, and we do a lot for people who have vision disabilities, but not a lot is done for hearing loss disabilities. So I'd like to know, in the city, we have an FM system here. In the city, what other main buildings, city halls, courtrooms, community centers, park senior centers, any of those, do any of those have hearing access? And have you noticed, or are you following up on whether those are actually used or not? Those are my questions.
I'm going to let Phil answer first, and then I'll jump in.
Well, actually, Ray and I have talked about this.
And Phil,
Yeah.
that microphone doesn't really work very well, so if you could stand closer to her.
Oh,
so
it's-
that it picks up.
All this is for the recording.
Yeah,
It's not amplification.
Yeah,
Wherever-
so this is the microphone
There
that,
we go.
yeah, you can hear me now. So Ray is an employee here with the City of Edmond. You probably know her. And we've talked about that very thing. And that's something that we can bring up with our advisory board and start talking about captioning and some of those kinds of things for events at the Mitch Park and things like that. So yes, that's the kind of input we're looking for sure.
Do any buildings have that access now? Do most buildings have at least the FM systems now?
The system that we have here, this is a portable system, and anybody who requests those assisted listening devices, we can provide those for them.
In any city building is what she's saying. It's not
Yes.
just in this building.
Yes. Well, I'll say the city council has these available. My office has them available, but what we have done is at the top of every agenda for public meetings, we encourage the disabled community to contact us if they need any kind of assistance, and my email and phone number are right there. So we ask 48 hours in advance, and at that point that I can make sure that whatever department needs that can get it. We are exploring, we have some folks coming into town next week to look at room loops, hearing loops. Of course, I don't know, right now we don't know what the cost of that is and where that would be prioritized, but I do want to take that before the advisory board and talk about those. We have, all new facilities are going to have the hearing loops around the room. Yeah. And we have our latest water resources facility out there is a really good example, and they have that
They have a
installed.
working loop right now?
They have them, well, I don't know if it's working. We're going to go out next week and look at that. But they have been installed, so.
Fantastic.
Okay, so to kind of tag onto your question. And I don't think you were here when I said that I've actually been doing access issues since 1977. And so when ADA first came out, I was on the White House lawn the day ADA was signed. And when ADA first came out, the biggest issue was going to be for facilities for people with mobility impairments. So the original ADAG that came out in 1991 was more specific to facilities and more specific to people with mobility impairments. When we did the update in 2010, they put in a lot of information for people with sensory impairments. There's a lot more now for people with both visual and hearing impairments. They did a lot of testing. The U.S. Access Board did some research on the different types of assistive listening systems. What is most effective? What is a good communication tool? Up to and including just texting messages back and forth when somebody is standing in front of you and we're not understanding each other. So there's a lot of things that have been done, and a lot of the information that we get in terms of implementing for large entities like airports and NFL stadiums and things like that, we get from Gallaudet. Gallaudet is very, very involved, and they do a lot of the research and provide us with a lot of the technology information. So I think you'll see more and more of that as we move forward. We have a huge percentage of people with low or no hearing, and as we age, that number keeps growing. And so I think it is something that is getting utilized. I think that the systems are getting utilized once people know that they're there. Most entities initially went to this portable system because it's the cheapest. And what they're finding is that they don't last very long, and it's probably better to invest into like the Loop or an infrared system of some sort. And so it's kind of a learning process. But at least they started somewhere, and the portable systems are what most entities started with. Okay?
Just a little follow-up question on that. You mentioned, I mean, obviously, if you see a broken curve and you want it fixed, there's no way for you to know unless we tell you. And then that becomes, somewhere on the priority chain. With hearing loss, it is an invisible disability.
Mm-hmm.
It also carries a large stigma in that there's probably, 2.6 people in this room that need it, and that, probably 1.6 of them won't fit it. So my question is it a need of complaints? Do we need to form a, hey, speak up for yourself, where do you want to hear better? Or is it a standard commitment from the city that, yes, we understand there's a lot of people in this room, we have 1,000 people in here, there's no way we can have that many headsets for those people. Is it really an amount of, we just need to hear how many are out here? Is it the voice from your citizens that is going to make a difference?
That's right. That's what's going to make the most difference is hearing from you. Like I was trying to say earlier, any complaint that we get, any input from any resident is going to go to the top of the list at the advisory board. We have our standard list that we're trying to accomplish this year, like she was talking about from the transition plan. But if somebody says, I'm having this problem right now and I can't wait 20 years for you to fix it, that's what we want to look at and try to address.
Yeah, and to add to that, there is so much education that has to happen within the different disability groups themselves. And they, after 29 years, there are still people who just won't be their own voice. But that's really the only way to get things done. ADA was started because people started saying, hey, we matter too. And so any opportunity that I have to educate the disability community, I love to get involved and help them understand, hey, they can't fix it if they don't know it's broken. And so if you have a large group of people with hearing impairments that you have influence on, by all means, the educational opportunities are endless.
I'll just say one of the things I'll be the first to say that the city's not perfect, but we do want to try to address our residents the best that we can. And one of the things we're doing for this, why I asked for the video camera, is so that we can YouTube this and have it captioned for afterwards. So we'll post this meeting for a little bit after. It won't be up permanently, and it's not going to be on TV, but it'll be posted for a short time.
Any other questions? Thoughts, ideas, concerns, war stories? Can always count on Willis.
Well, not to beat a dead horse, but so low priority things such as, like, I'll say bathrooms, because one thing that in my world that I run into on a day-to-day basis is that someone's always in the stall that I need. Case in point, me and Jack had lunch before this, and I had to wait, a little while to get into the restroom. I understand ADA or what has been set as the standard, but how do we as advocates, although this is probably a low priority issue in the big scheme of things, get the new bills? So say that they have the room, but because they go off of the standards, they only put in one roll-in stall. But they had the room, and let's say for whatever reason they have 2 or 3 toilets, lavatories. How do we get across to, I'm gonna say, the powers that be or the people in charge? If you have the room and in the budget per se, I mean, the door size is not that big of a cost. You had to put in the side partition anyway to go ahead and put in 2 roll-in stalls as opposed to going off of the right now standards, which are becoming outdated. How do we go about? So it was kind of promoted.
Yeah, no, and I get what you're saying. First of all, know that there are actually, the requirement is that 5% of the stalls are accessible. So until you get to a certain number of stalls, there's only going to be 1, okay? But if you have 6 or more stalls, then you also have to have an ambulatory stall. Ambulatory stall has an outward swinging door with, handrails on both sides. And so a lot of people who now are taking up the accessible stall will take up that one. In terms of getting more in a specific facility, if you're in a community where they're building something brand new, get involved in that, okay? Speak to the city, say, hey, there's a lot of people here that are disabled, and can you do above and beyond, okay? And a lot of them will. Sometimes it's a cost, and sometimes it depends on at what point you get involved. If they're already done and at their final construction documents, probably not going to make a change. But if you start early in the process, then they should be able to design according to the need of the community, even if it is above and beyond the requirements of the law.
There is for retrofitting new facilities or retrofitting old facilities, that does become an issue, space. And we have a really good example of that just happened last year with the MAC out at Mitch Park. So we retrofitted one of the restrooms out there, but there just wasn't enough space to put more than,
If you're downtown, it used to be the zoo, now it's gonna be the mule. And there's the perfect thing, go through the back, wide hallway, large facility, and somebody has a pretty big get.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't think it changes your answer, but to be clear on what we're seeing we can win is so many nice facilities and new facilities have one big bathroom that meets the accessible requirements, but even in the men's, the urinal's in there. So if somebody's using the urinal, he's locked out. And it looks like there could be something to say, you got the space, it's clearly enough space, they just need to try to separate it a little more where you could achieve a multi-use instead of just one room.
So it's like a single user,
Yeah,
single user
yeah,
toilet room?
absolutely. Lock it
Yeah,
up.
And to change those standards, that's really at the federal level, right? That they would have to.
yeah. Yeah, and getting involved, I mean, I've been involved with the Access Board for decades. It's easy to be involved, and, excuse me, I felt that coming, I just wasn't sure where it was. It's easy to get involved and, get on their committees, they ask for comments on things all the time, Be heard.
Yeah, I just want to say too that I'm the official ADA coordinator for the city, but we have folks in all the departments that are looking at these issues. I'm not sure what his official title is. He's in engineering and he looks at new facilities. He's very on top of what the ADA requirements are and what they should be, and is there room to do more? And he's on top of the architects that are designing the project. So,
Randy?
yeah,
Yeah, he's
Randy Drew.
awesome.
So,
And my thing is, because some don't live with our experience, that it's not, necessarily on the radar. I bump it, okay. Because it's, I live it, I'll say. Some people, they don't encounter it, and I do on a daily basis, and I know that it wouldn't necessarily be on their radar. So I understand, though, about getting involved, so I appreciate that.
The other thing is, I have a grandson that's in a wheelchair, and from the time he was just very young, that he could talk, those people have to understand that most people are kind. Most people are not mean. If they're staring at you, just say, I notice you're interested in something. Could I answer this for you? And if you approach it in that way, I think more and more people are actually going to learn and want to see the improvements, even if they don't have any sort of disability.
Yeah,
Because they might.
I've got a friend who got the small white, or the small wheels in the front, so that they light up when he rolls, and that was just to encourage kids to get involved. And so kids come up, they see they're drawn to it, and they ask questions, because a lot of times parents are so afraid of what the kids are gonna ask, they pull them away, and what the kid learns is to be afraid of somebody with a disability.
Right.
And that's the wrong way to
Absolutely.
be.
So you just, and sometimes he's been known to give like little kids rides.
Yeah.
It makes me nervous, but I think it does make everyone aware that it happens. It
Yeah.
happens not just to adults, but
Bill?
children.
Last question, you had mentioned that,
there's often mayor's lunches and mayor's breakfasts, and when does your city's, do you have a disability group or an ADA accessible planning group that meets? And just kind of a plug for our association, we're the Hearing Loss Association, the Central Oklahoma chapter. Everyone is always welcome. We'll feed you lunch and so forth. But we meet at Will Rogers Park, the exhibition center, on the third Thursday of every month from 11:30 to 1. But we have a lot of time that has built in so that there can be some conversation. We would love to invite the City of Edmond. I think you'd be a fantastic resource for us. And we are a resource for all of Oklahoma, so we're happy to help in any way.
I'll just thank you for that. Currently, the city does not have a disability group like that. That's something we want to talk about, but currently, no.
A lot of cities around the country, the way that it used to be set up, there were mayors, they're called the mayor's city, unemployment of people with disabilities. Okay, and then every state has a governor's association that all of the mayor's committees kind of talk to the governor's committee, and then there's a national committee. So those committees are really important. Not every city has one, but every city can have one if they want to. And then some have their own committee that has nothing to do with that network, and they just kind of handle local issues. And all it takes is people who are interested to form a committee. And Phil and I have been talking about, getting a good, strong committee for Edmond. It's certainly big enough now, and there seems to be enough interest. So I think that it would be a good opportunity. Well, I'm not going to make you sit here and stare at me until 3:30. So
Thank you, everyone, for
we
coming.
appreciate your participation. I have some cards if you think that there's questions that you might have later that you'd like to get addressed.